Hi there, friends. I'm so glad that you're here. Today's card is all about creating a watercolor background that adds all the color you need. I'm featuring a stamp from Unity Stamp Company and an easy layout that lets the stamp shine. So let's get started and assemble this card. I'm going to start by creating my watercolor background. I have watercolor paper. I'll be using a lot of water and cardstock cannot handle that. Also, the watercolor doesn't move as well on cardstock, so I'm using Fabriano watercolor paper. I am using also a paintbrush and water in my cup. I just laid down a bit of water in the shape that I want for my background. This is going to allow the watercolor to kind of start to move in that area. Kind of keeps it contained, so it'll move on its own, but still stay in that kind of center area where I put the water. I am using Distress Ink re-inkers to watercolor with. You can use whatever your favorite watercolor medium is. I created my own watercolor palette just by putting a little bit of those re-inkers in each of the wells, and then I'm picking that up with my brush. First, I laid down a little bit of worn lipstick and I just tapped that on, added a little bit of water to help it kind of move, and it'll start to move within the water that I already placed down on my paper. I am cleaning my brush off with some water and then I wipe it on a baby wipe just to make sure I get rid of most of that color. Next, I'm going to pick up a bit of dried marigold and tap that on. I like to do a tapping motion. It just doesn't create this smooth blend. It creates more of a splotchy look, and then the water kind of helps it spread itself out. Once I dry it with my heat tool, it'll spread and blend all on its own, and it'll kind of create more of a kind of cohesive background look, but it's still a bit splotchy. And that's what I like to do. You can play around and kind of build your background however you like. This is going to take a little bit of time to dry with my heat tool. I do want to dry it because my next layer is going to lay on top and we'll get more variation of color that way. The next layer is going to be deeper and darker, and I'll use a little bit less water so it doesn't blend into the background, and that way it'll sit up on top and we'll get a bit more vibrancy. So I'm going back with my worn lipstick and I'm going to tap that in over on top, and this is where you can again play around with your vibrancy and how much you add. More pigment means it's going to be brighter and darker. More water with that pigment is going to make it a little less vibrant and more transparent. So I'm just lightly adding it. You don't want to go too far. Less is more sometimes. I have that problem of going way more than I need. So I am going to back off at this point and just kind of stop. I added some splatters with the leftover that was on my brush, picked up a little bit of the worn lipstick to add some splatters, and then at the end I added water splatters just to give a little bit of texture in that background. Now I'm going to let this sit and dry all on its own, or you could use your heat tool to dry it quicker. Next, I stamped the image from Where Butterflies Wait on some vellum. For me, I get the best results using Hero Art's Inktensified Black or Gina K Amalgamate. Both of those work really well on vellum, and you just want to make sure you heat set it so it doesn't smear. Next, I die cut some text paper from the And Then It Was Spring paper pack. I'm using a Hero Arts postage die for that. And I'm going to glue that on top of my vellum, and that's just going to frame around that stamped flowers. And then I put glue behind the frame, and then I'm going to glue that to the front of my card. That way it hides the glue from the vellum. I just really like the soft look that the vellum gives the background. You could just stamp your image directly over that background. It's just going to have a more vibrant look. I like the way that softness kind of blends out the background, and then the flowers kind of pop a little bit more against that, but either way would look really pretty. I used the Unity postage dies this time for a little postage stamp on the side here, and then I used an extra little swatch of watercolor to punch out a heart, and that'll go behind my sentiment. I popped up the one side of the sentiment with foam tape and then glued it flat to the heart so they'll be on the same level, and then I added a multi-loop string bow just to finish off those little elements. in the corner. Last, I'm going to add a little bit of sparkle. This is some gold glitter glue, and I'm just going to squeeze that out on some scrap paper and then use a paintbrush to paint that onto my flowers. This way it's a nice thin layer of that glue and the glitter is not so bulky. And I just like the control that I have of placing that over the flowers and the areas that I want by using a paintbrush. When you're done, make sure you wash your paintbrush really well to get all that glue out so it doesn't clump together and ruin your brush. And here is the final card. I love how the watercolor background does all the coloring for me, while the vellum layer softens the look and lets the flowers really shine through. The simple frame and small accents behind the sentiment add just enough detail without taking away from the softness of the design. Thank you so much for creating with me. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Bye!